So picture a world that's sort of on the edge. Climate change is happening. Resources are drying up, right? And you've got these hunter-gatherer societies facing increasing competition for a shrinking pie. So farming, even in its earliest forms, might have just started to look like, the only way to survive.
So out of desperation almost, huh? Like out of a need to secure a stable food supply, humans start planting crops.
Yeah, I could see how that would make sense. But what about the other theory then?
Okay, so this one might seem a bit counterintuitive, especially when you think about all the backbreaking work of early farming, right? But this theory suggests that agriculture might have actually emerged during times of relative abundance. Really? So instead of being driven by scarcity, they were driven by what? Curiosity, abundance?
Right. Exactly. Or imagine a scenario where communities actually had a surplus of food.
Right.
So that frees up time and energy for things beyond mere survival. Maybe even allows for, a little experimentation.
Yeah.
So perhaps some groups finding themselves with this newfound kind of breathing room, they just started, I don't know, maybe intentionally tending to wild stands of plants they liked.
So they went from just gathering what they could find to actually encouraging certain plants to grow in certain places. I guess that makes sense though if they actually had the resources to do it. They could see what would happen if they actually took a more active role.
Right. And it wasn't necessarily a conscious decision to let's invent agriculture as we know it, but it might have been the spark, just a happy accident almost, that blossomed from having a little extra time and resources.
Wow. It really makes you wonder about those early farmers then, huh? Were they driven by this impending doom, or were they just curious about what would happen if they, planted a few extra seeds, or maybe it was even a bit of both?
See, that's the beauty of it. The reality is there likely wasn't just this one single path to agriculture, right? It was probably a messy mix of factors.
Yeah.
Local environments, the types of plants and animals that were available. Of course, a healthy dose of luck probably played a role too.
Yeah, I like that. A messy mix of factors. Trial and error, maybe even a few happy accidents along the way. It makes those early agricultural breakthroughs feel a little more relatable,
It really does. And what's fascinating too is that even negative events like, say, losing territory to another group, right? That could have inadvertently sort of nudged people toward a more agricultural lifestyle. So it wasn't always progress. Sometimes it was just about adapting to a less stable world.
So we've got this long, slow process of domestication happening over millennia, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes out of curiosity. It makes you realize how little control we really have over these things, right? But I'm curious, when we're talking about those local environments and the types of plants available, does that mean agriculture didn't develop everywhere at the same time, even if the conditions were right?
You're absolutely right. It wasn't as simple as, you've got the right climate and fertile soil, boom, agriculture.
Yeah, it does it's one of those things you don't really think about, but yeah, if you've got everything you need, why wouldn't it just take off everywhere, right?
Well, it turns out those intangible factors, like how a society is organized, its unique knowledge base, even just a little bit of luck, those things played a huge role.
Oh, interesting. So even with the perfect ingredients, you still needed the right recipe, so to speak.
Precisely. Think about it domesticating plants. That requires real knowledge, right? You have to understand their life cycles, you have to have the patience to selectively breed them, and the foresight to save seeds for the next season. Those aren't skills you just pick up overnight. They're passed down, built upon over generations.
It's like that saying, it takes a village. Maybe it really did take a whole village with all its, shared knowledge and cooperation to make those early agricultural breakthroughs actually stick.
I love that analogy because it wasn't just about, one person stumbling upon a wild ancestor of wheat and figuring out how to plant it.
Yeah.
It took this really special mix of environmental opportunities and then societal ingenuity to make it work. And that's what makes it so fascinating to zoom out and look at where agriculture did and didn't take root around the world. You start to see how these cultural and social factors played out in all these different ways.
Yeah, it really highlights how much context matters, huh? And speaking of context, one of the things that really struck me while reading these sources was this idea of agricultural ecologies. It seems like that term really kind of encapsulates this whole idea of interconnectedness we've been talking about.
It does. And that's a concept this current biology article really dives into because it moves beyond just looking at individual crops, and it starts to consider the entire web of interactions that emerge with domestication. So the people, the plants, the animals, the soil, even the pests and diseases, it's all connected.
So it's less about humans like imposing their will on nature and more about this intricate dance where everyone's adapting and responding to each other's moves.
Exactly. It's this incredible co-evolutionary dance that's been going on for millennia and has led to this amazing diversity of like agricultural ecosystems around the world.
Yeah.
Think about like the rice paddies of Southeast Asia versus the terraced fields of the Andes. Each one of those is this unique response to local conditions, cultural practices, and the plants themselves.
That's so cool. It makes you appreciate the sheer ingenuity and adaptability of those early agricultural systems. But it also makes you wonder, if these systems were so successful for so long, why are we facing so many challenges today?
That's a great question. And it gets at one of the biggest issues facing, modern agriculture, which is this loss of that very diversity we're talking about. As we focused on a smaller and smaller number of high-yielding crops, we've inadvertently sort of narrowed the genetic base of our food supply.
It's like putting all our eggs in one basket, right? And if that basket gets hit by, I don't know, like a disease or a pest, we're in trouble.
Exactly. And that's why, understanding this long view of domestication is so important. Because it's not just about increasing yields, it's about preserving the genetic diversity that ensures long-term resilience.
So you're saying that, like, by learning from the past, from how these ancient agricultural systems adapted and diversified, we can actually glean some valuable insights for the future. I mean, are there any specific examples from our research that really highlight that?
Absolutely. The Current Biology article, it talks about sorghum in ancient Nubia. And it's a great example because archaeologists were actually able to track the genetic diversity of this, important crop over time. And what they found is fascinating. For a while, things were going great, sorghum. It was thriving. But then its genetic diversity started to decline.
Oh no, that doesn't sound good. What happens when a crop starts to lose its genetic diversity?
Well, it leads to what's called a genetic load. Basically, it's a buildup of kind of harmful mutations. Think of it like without enough genetic mixing, crops are more likely to inherit weaknesses.
That makes sense. It's kind of like how inbreeding can cause problems in animals. So did Nubian sorghum just like die out?
That's the remarkable part, it didn't. You see, they found evidence of what's called genetic rescue. So new populations of sorghum with fresh genetic material were brought in from elsewhere, and that helped boost the crop's resilience and allowed it to thrive again.
Wow, that's incredible. It's like a transfusion of healthy genes helping the crop bounce back.
It's a great analogy. And it underscores just how essential, maintaining genetic diversity is, both within individual crops and across like whole agricultural landscapes.
Yeah, it's like having a diverse investment portfolio. You spread the risk and increase the chance of like long-term success. But instead of stocks and bonds, we're talking about, different varieties of plants. It makes you wonder, though, with all this talk about preserving diversity, are there crops we've already lost that we should try to bring back?
That's the million-dollar question. There's a whole world of like forgotten or orphaned crops out there, plants that were once cultivated but have, fallen out of favor for various reasons.
Yeah.
And some of them have incredible potential.
Like what? Give me an example.
Okay, take Ethiopian enset, for instance. It's this starchy staple crop that's been cultivated in the highlands of Ethiopia for centuries, but you rarely hear about it outside the region.
So what's so special about enset? Is it like some kind of superfood or something?
You could say that. For one, it's incredibly drought resistant, which is, huge in a region prone to unpredictable rainfall. Plus, it has a long shelf life, making it like vital for food security.
Wow, it's like this hidden gem. And I bet there are others out there too, right?
Absolutely. There's Andean oca, this colorful tuber that's full of antioxidants, or Indian Brachyuria ramosa millet, known for being like super hardy and adaptable. And those are just a few examples. There's this whole hidden world of plants out there, each with these unique traits that could help us tackle, modern agricultural challenges.
It's like raiding the pantry of history. But it's not just about finding these lost crops, is it? It's also about understanding like why some of them disappeared in the first place.
You're right. Sometimes, a newer, more productive variety comes along. Other times, changes in climate or agricultural practices can make a once thriving crop less viable. And sometimes it's a bit of a mystery, like with Triticum timothyvi wheat.
Right, we talked about that earlier. It was this major crop for a while, but then...
That's just it. It was widespread in parts of Turkey, like thousands of years ago, even spreading to new regions. But slowly, it lost its place. Today, it's only cultivated in very, very specific areas.
Huh. It makes you realize that, like, agriculture is in constant flux, What thrives in one era might might fade in another. It's both humbling and a little bit intimidating, right?
I agree. It really highlights how crucial, like, careful stewardship of our agricultural systems is. We're not just inheriting a legacy, we're responsible for shaping its future.
Yeah.
And a big part of that is learning from the successes and the mistakes of the past.
Speaking of which, we've talked a lot about plants, but I know the current biology article also kind of delves into the role of insects in agriculture. And I have to say, that's not a connection I'd ever really considered before.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah.
We often overlook those tiny creatures, but they're really essential players in the agricultural world.
Totally. I mean, they can be pollinators, pests, beneficial allies, formidable foes, all at the same time.
It's a delicate balance.
Yeah.
And one that has definitely been shifting, as human agriculture has intensified.
Yeah, that's what really struck me in the article. Like, the emergence of agriculture, it didn't just create these new ecological niches for, crops and livestock. It did the same for insects, didn't it?
It absolutely did. The article calls them domesticoids, those insect species that have adapted to and often thrive in, human-created agricultural ecosystems. And their populations often explode in response to, like, the banquet of food and shelter that farms unintentionally provide.
It's like we accidentally rolled out the red carpet for certain insect species. I'm guessing that includes those less than desirable guests, like grain weevils and aphids and those pesky flies that always seem to be buzzing around livestock.
You got it.
Yeah.
They're as much a part of the agricultural web as anything else. And their presence has, it's shaped our agricultural practices, leading to the development of pesticides and the breeding of insect-resistant crops.
So we try to outsmart them, they adapt, we try something new. It's like this ongoing arms race. It really drives home that point about, coevolution with humans and insects constantly responding to each other.
Exactly. It's yet another layer of complexity in this already intricate story. As we move forward, facing new challenges like climate change and resource scarcity, we have to keep this complexity in mind.
It really is, yeah. It's like a whole hidden world right under our noses, huh? And it underscores how interconnected everything in agriculture is. From those tiny insects all the way up to global climate patterns. We can't really afford to think about these things in isolation anymore, can we?
We can't. And we've been talking about the importance of diversity, learning from the past, but when it comes to actually facing these big challenges, climate change, feeding a growing population, what does that actually look like, practically speaking? What are some steps we can take?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. Well, one of the most important things is probably shifting our focus. So moving away from just maximizing yield at all costs, and instead really trying to create these more resilient, adaptable agricultural systems. I mean, the current biology article really emphasizes that, doesn't it?
It does, and it suggests that, instead of relying on just a handful of these high-yielding but kind of vulnerable crops, we need to diversify, bring back some of those forgotten varieties that might have the genetic tools to withstand, like drought, pests, changing temperatures, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Think about those orphan crops like that Ethiopian enset we were talking about. Naturally drought-resistant, perfect for those unpredictable climates. I mean, they're like blueprints for resilience that we've just kind of forgotten about.
It's like we've been trying to reinvent the wheel when the solutions were sitting right there in a field somewhere, just waiting to be rediscovered.
That's a great way to put it. And it's not just about the crops themselves either. It's about how we actually grow them, too. Like, we need to move away from monoculture, those massive fields of a single crop. I mean, they might be efficient in the short term, but they're just incredibly vulnerable to disease, disruption. If one plant gets it, they all get it.
Right, right. So instead of these vast monocultures, we should be looking towards more, diverse integrated approaches. So you're talking about things like agroforestry and permaculture, where you're really trying to mimic the complexity of natural ecosystems.
Precisely. Agroforestry, with its mix of trees and crops, can create a much more balanced and resilient system. And permaculture, with that emphasis on mimicking natural patterns and cycles, it really offers a holistic approach. It's about working with nature's wisdom, not against it.
We've definitely uncovered a treasure trove of insights in this deep dive, about domestication, resilience, the surprising connections that have shaped our world, really. It's clear there's still so much to learn, and who knows, maybe the solutions to today's problems are actually hidden in the fields of yesterday.